Hello, this is Ruslan Belov. Yesterday, Zelensky made a statement saying that Putin would be forced into peace by force. How can one even comment on that? I honestly don't know. The battles at the front are ongoing, and we continue to study the situation. And by tradition, as always, I would like to sincerely ask you to subscribe to the channel. If you are watching my videos not for the first time and are still not subscribed, please subscribe. Your subscription helps the channel grow. Thanks to everyone who has subscribed. So friends, do you know how much territory the Russian army captured in the past 24 hours? More than 80 square kilometers, an incredible result for an autumn month. There were very good advances, and you'll never guess where, in the Dnipropetrovsk region. But let's go step by step, and I'd like to begin with an attempt by the armed forces of Ukraine to launch a counter-offensive in the south, in a region we rarely cover in these reports, since very little happens there. I'm speaking, of course, about the Kherson region. But over the past day, in the spirit of the years 2023 and 2024, the Ukrainian forces attempted to land a group by boat on the left bank, which is under Russian control. Probably the plan was to create another Krinky scenario. You remember when the AFU captured the village of Krinky near the Dnipro, they held it for several months, and Russian drone operators eliminated more than 1,000 soldiers there, many of whom stayed there forever. Relatives in Kyiv still regularly hold rallies about that, but they achieve nothing. One more detail about that operation: a single Russian drone operator destroyed more than 800 Ukrainian soldiers there. And the most interesting part is that this is confirmed by video evidence. Every strike and geolocation was recorded. That shows how dangerous drones are and how many soldiers Ukraine lost back then in those senseless attacks. Some of their best units too, because those were not ordinary troops, but Marines trained in the United Kingdom specifically for amphibious landings. By 2025, it has become obvious that launching amphibious assaults is an extremely dangerous undertaking. You can lose a huge number of soldiers, and ensuring logistics in such attacks is an even greater problem. Back then, the AFU tried to supply themselves with drones, but you cannot build proper logistics with drones. You can deliver a bottle of water, but how do you deliver ammunition with drones? Now let's see what the AFU attempted here. They moved out from the village of Sadov, went around the sand spit, and moved along the Dnipro River, intending to land in the area of Kazachi Lageri. But they never made it, or in this case, they never even reached the shore. Russian drone operators constantly monitor the river, so of course they spotted the boat and immediately struck it, sending Ukrainian soldiers swimming. And you can imagine what happens to a soldier in body armor and full gear in the water. With drones flying overhead, they were just like targets at a shooting range. Only here the targets were soldiers. As for advances, there are no advances in the Kherson region, and there cannot be. The river itself is the line of contact. To cross it, only in the way those AFU fighters tried, is nothing but suicide. So let's move on to the major advances. They occurred in the zone of responsibility of the Vostok group. There were many advances, so let's take them in order. First of all, Russian forces cleared out a large pocket between two villages, Alexandragrad and Iskra, or as it's also called, the village of Alexander Klevtsov. Do you see the dotted line? That was the old line of contact, as of 1 day ago. But now it runs along the border with the Dnipropetrovsk region, more precisely along the Volchya River. The advance here was more than 7 kilometers wide, and the depth was also significant, from 4 to 5 kilometers. Thanks to clearing this pocket, which had long been expected, the territory that came under Russian control amounted to 31 square kilometers. Imagine that, in just one area. The Vostok group is essentially a powerful steamroller that the AFU simply cannot stop. And now that steamroller has turned toward the Dnipropetrovsk region, logically they reached the border, crossed it, and are now advancing forward. The fighters showed footage from different parts of Novoselki, confirming firm control over the settlement. Moreover, in addition to capturing the village, Russian forces cleared the area north of it. They advanced 2 kilometers up to the river. But this is nothing compared to what happened farther south. There, the fighters made a breakthrough of 9 kilometers. Sounds impressive, right? The Dnipropetrovsk region has now become a full-fledged area of combat operations, and the Russian army is advancing there quite rapidly. Now, a few more words about Novosilovka. The village was captured, but as I told you in yesterday's report, to ensure full control of the village and the entire area, it is necessary to also take control of the small forest beyond the river. Because as long as the AFU controls it and sits in its fortified positions there, they will always put pressure on the village, making raids and trying to slip in, contesting Russian control. So although the cartographers colored the map red, correctly since footage confirms Russian control, we must be ready for AFU counterattacks. That is why one of the most important tasks now is to secure that forest. Then control will be truly stable. By the way, with the capture of Novosilovka, Russian forces are now only 1.5 kilometers away from the large village of Velikaya Mikhailovka. This direction is even called the Veliko-Mikhailovka axis. But judging by the pace of the advance here, soon it will become the Pokrovsk axis, since after Velikaya Mikhailovka, the movement will undoubtedly proceed toward the town of Pokrovskoye. But that's about the prospects. As for the current advances, in addition to capturing Novosilovka, the fighters also cleared a pocket between this Novosilovka and Voronoye. The advance there was 4.5 kilometers. The most important part is not just the clearing itself, but that the troops reached the eastern outskirts of another village called Koroshi and immediately took it under control. And from Koroshi it is only 500 meters to the next village, Sosnovka. So very soon, it seems several more villages in the Dnipropetrovsk region will fall under Russian control. But the biggest breakthrough happened in the south of the Donetsk region. From Shevchenko, Russian troops advanced westward and reached Ternovo. The depth of the breakthrough was 9, even more than 9 kilometers. Furthermore, in this area to the north, they entered the Dnipropetrovsk region and advanced there by 4.5 kilometers. Also farther south, they entered the Dnipropetrovsk region again and expanded the zone of control there by 3.5 kilometers, reaching Ternovo from the south. And now pressure is also being applied to the village of Beryozovoe, since from the current positions it is only 1.5 kilometers away. The total area of this entire section that came under Russian control amounts to 32.5 square kilometers, a more than impressive result. So what do we have? The south of the Donetsk region is fully under control. The Vostok group has completed its task here and has now fully switched to advancing in the Dnipropetrovsk region. That explains these impressive numbers. Of course, I must add that the AFU will not stop trying to launch counterattacks, not even to recapture territory in the Donetsk region, but rather to slow down the advance into the Dnipropetrovsk region. For now, they still have some chances for counterattacks, at least here near Ternovo, as long as the Russian army holds the border. But the toughest sector is farther north. Here, the whole stretch where the line of contact runs along the river, marking the regional border. There will always be a risk of counterattacks. We can only speak of truly stable control of the south of the Donetsk region when the AFU are pushed back at least a couple of kilometers. In any case, what the Vostok fighters are doing here is simply incredible. Let's move further. There was also progress in the zone of responsibility of the center group. There, Russian forces managed to organize an attack along the column route toward Mirnograd and made substantial progress toward the city, capturing the shaft area of mine number 3, Stakhanov. Now the Russian forward positions are less than 1 kilometer from the first houses of the city. Without a doubt, very soon we will regularly hear news of Russian reconnaissance groups penetrating Mirnograd and probing its defenses. I am more than certain that the situation for the AFU there is no better than in Pokrovsk, which means Russian recon and sabotage groups will be able to act confidently. Also, just before recording this video, we received information that the village of Markovo also came under Russian control. We haven't had any updates from that sector for a long time. Here, Russian forces crossed the canal and are essentially heading directly toward Kramatorsk. Perhaps the goal of the Russian army is simply to get closer to the city from this side and start applying pressure from the east, forcing the AFU to transfer significant forces here. And they will have to transfer them because the cities in this area are very important. If you look at the map, you can see how many fortifications there are. We are waiting for confirmation from this settlement. If we look at the distance, it is only 17 kilometers from this village to the city center, not much by the standards of this war. and a little more than 13 kilometers to the outskirts. This means FPV drones can operate here in their normal mode. By getting a little closer to the city, Russian forces can easily cut off Konstantinovka's supply lines with FPV drones from this direction, and logistics in this war are of crucial importance. Summing up the overall advances, over the past 24 hours, the Russian army has taken control of an impressive 82 square kilometers. Honestly, I didn't think I would see such figures in September, but the army managed to impress. Now let's turn our attention to the world of politics, since the global reshuffle in world politics is moving very actively. Zelensky continues to torpedo any options for a peaceful settlement, putting forward inflated demands. His new narrative is aimed at the short-sighted, those who lack logic, according to the Telegram channel Legitimny. Look, in an interview with Le Point, he said that the South Korean scenario would not suit Ukraine, since the population of North Korea is just over 20 million people, while Russia's population is more than 140 million. The scale of these threats is incomparable. The threat from Russia is 5, 6, or even 10 times greater, he claimed. Exact copying of the South Korean model, he said, probably would not suit Ukraine from the perspective of security. From another angle, its economic model is a good example. Absolute nonsense. So such a peace plan doesn't work, but war with a 140 million nuclear state, which is many times better equipped in terms of technology, missiles, bombs, aviation, and so on, that's fine. Then why did they get involved in the war in the first place, according to his logic? And the conclusion is simple. Zelensky doesn't care what you propose. He has one task: to disrupt peace at any cost and prolong the war, because that task was set for him by his globalist handlers, who, by the way, dragged him into the war and did not allow him to end the confrontation at the early stages in 2022 after the Istanbul agreements. The country is heading for complete disaster. Moreover, Vladimir Putin stated that Russia would have to achieve its goals if it is not possible to reach an agreement. If common sense prevails, then it is possible to agree on an acceptable option for ending the conflict, said Vladimir Putin. But if not, then we will have to solve all the tasks set by military means. Vladimir Putin also revealed details of the negotiations with Ukraine in 2022. He said that the Ukrainian side had declared, in somewhat rougher language, that we will fight until either you tear our heads off or we tear yours off, and that this was received after Russia, following the calls of Western countries, withdrew its troops from Kyiv. Nevertheless, the Russian leader believes that with the current US administration, there is light at the end of the tunnel regarding negotiations. The talks of the so-called coalition of the willing in Paris did not lead to any results, and Ukraine's European allies continue running in circles. They cannot force Trump to pursue Biden's Ukraine policy, and without American support, all their guarantees to Kyiv are worthless. In turn, Washington cannot force European leaders to agree to the deals it reached with Putin in Anchorage. As a result, everyone was left with their own positions. At the same time, it is already clear that the possibilities for economic pressure on Russia by the European countries and the United States have run out. The attempt to play the long-discussed card of secondary sanctions against Moscow has turned into a geopolitical catastrophe for Washington. They didn't even seriously try to impose them against China, so as not to spoil the negotiating atmosphere around the new Sino-American trade agreement. The introduction of additional trade tariffs against India resulted in New Delhi demonstratively turning away from Washington toward Beijing, as well as further strengthening relations with Moscow. In fact, Trump unintentionally contributed to the emergence of a major Eurasian triangle consisting of India, China, and Russia. By the way, it's still too early to draw conclusions here. It is not clear how stable Prime Minister Narendra Modi's anti-American trend will be. However, the card of secondary sanctions is practically beaten for now. Entering into a direct war with Russia over Ukraine is something that Europe and the United States predictably do not want. At the same time, everyone understands that in the long term, Kyiv will lose this war, and if it drags on, it could even lose its statehood entirely. Against this background, two Western approaches to settling the conflict in Ukraine have emerged. The first, the American approach, envisions territorial concessions to Russia, though not as significant as Moscow demands, and a non-aligned status for Ukraine, with the possibility of its accession to the European Union in the future. The second, the European approach, is based on the formula war until the last Ukrainian, and then let fate decide. European leaders are counting on the United States not wanting to hand Russia an absolute victory and stepping in if it comes to the closure of the Ukrainian project politically. The American plan is fairly pragmatic, while the European one is cynical. But for now, the United States cannot impose its vision on Europe, and Europe, in turn, cannot convince its overseas partner of the correctness of its own approach. Meanwhile, Russia continues its military operation in Ukraine and now has a certain degree of support from the global East. And this will continue until the front itself delivers its verdict. When was the last time the East tried to set the rules of the game in international affairs? Since the 17th century, Western dominance has been indisputable, and in one way or another, only the Western-centric model operated in world politics. The center of the Western world shifted from Europe to North America, but one thing remained unquestioned. The West determined and dictated the global political line. Serious changes occurred after 1945, when the USSR became a superpower, challenging the West on multiple fronts: economic, political, and military. However, after several decades, the Western world managed to neutralize it and fully restore its global dominance. Nevertheless, now it faces a new challenge, and a much stronger one than before. Because the emerging global East is economically comparable to the collective West, something the USSR never achieved, and militarily it has parity with it. At the same time, the moral authority of Western leaders has been severely undermined by endless adventurous military actions and interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Perhaps never in its history has the West been as weak as it is now. Does this mean that the unipolar Western-centric model of international relations is doomed? Not at all. But it is in deep crisis, and there is a good chance that in the long term the dominance of the West will come to an end.